In this lecture series, you're going to learn a very important concept, which is shell in Linux. You will learn what is shell, what is bash, and what are the different shell program implementations. And in the demo part, you will learn how to write bash scripts and execute them. So you will learn bash programming and scripting basics so that you can automate DevOps tasks with them. We can run all these commands here one by one. Create a user, assign a user to a group, create a folder, create a file, write to a file, change file permissions, install a software, start the application, etc. So all these commands can be executed on the command line interface one by one. So let's say we have configured a server with a new user, and then we have installed an application and started that application with the user, set all the file permissions, etc. And now let's say we need to run the same commands in the same order on another server to configure that other server as well. Do we want to execute the same commands one by one on the other server as well? Let's say we have 10 servers where we need to do exactly the same thing. So do we want to configure 10 different servers like this? Or what about if you want to keep the history of how you actually configured the server, or how you installed the software in case you need it later, or maybe a colleague may need it for their own server. Also, what if you need some logic when executing commands? Like, first you want to check whether a folder or file exists, or you want to check whether user has some permissions. Maybe you want to check a version of a program installed on your system, etc. What about bulk actions? Like you want to rename or move around 100 files at once. Maybe you want to add 10 users to your system and set permissions for them. Doing this one by one will be too much work, and this will make your commands more complex. Well, wouldn't it be convenient if we could write these commands into a file instead of executing them one by one on a terminal? And then we can execute that file, so all the commands will be executed in order. So advantage is that you can now move that file around. You can copy it somewhere else on another server and execute it there as well. You can share it with your teammates or with other colleagues in your company, etc. And you can store it somewhere for a later use. Well, that file with a bunch of shell commands is called a shell script. And you can add more complex logic to your commands in shell scripts. And shell script files have an extension of .sh. Now, when we're talking about shell scripts, what is shell and why do we call a file with a bunch of Linux commands a shell script? On a Unix-like systems, which includes Linux and macOS, shell is a program that takes commands that you type in the command line interface and translates them to instructions that your operating system kernel can understand. So it's a command interpreter and an interface between the user and the kernel. So the file that has a bunch of shell commands that the shell program can convert into instructions understandable for kernel is a shell script. There are different shell programs out there or different implementations of a shell program. There is a Bourne shell program with a short name sh, and its path in the Unix file system hierarchy is /bin/sh. So that's where the Bourne shell program is located, which used to be the default shell program of many Unix-like systems, including many older versions of Linux distributions. The name Bourne shell coming from its author, Stefan Bourne. And newer versions of Linux distributions, we have a shell program called bash, which stands for Bourne Again Shell, based on the name of Bourne shell, because bash is actually a more improved and feature-rich version of sh, or Bourne shell. And as I said, bash is currently the default shell program for most Unix-like systems. So bash command syntax is a superset of Bourne shell or sh command syntax. There are many other shell programs like Z shell, etc. But as I said, bash currently seems to be the standard on modern Unix systems. And because of that, Often shell and bash terms are actually used interchangeably. So we're talking about bash scripting and bash commands in place of shell scripting or shell commands. So in one summarized sentence, bash is a shell program, meaning command interpreter, as well as a fully featured programming language with which we can write shell scripts. So now that we got that cleared up, let's see how to actually write shell scripts using bash syntax. Now let's say we want to write a bash script for configuring a server. So let's create a file called setup and give it an extension of sh. So this is going to be our setup.sh shell script or bash script written in bash syntax. Now, since all shell script files have the same extension of .sh, how does the operating system know which shell to use to interpret and process that script file? So we may actually have multiple shell programs on the system, and maybe we wrote the shell script in sh or in bash or maybe in Z shell, who knows, right? So how does the system actually know this? Well, we tell the system ourselves which shell program to use to interpret that script. How? By writing what's called a shebang line as the very first line of the script. So I'm going to open this file, the setup.sh, using a Vim editor. You can of course use any text editor, any graphical editor that you want, because it's just the file that you can edit. And as the first line, we're going to write a shebang line that tells the operating system that this is going to be a bash syntax. So please use bash program to process that file. So this is a declaration of the syntax we're using here. And this path here that you see, /bin/bash, is actually the location of the bash program. So if I open a new terminal and do ls bin bash, you see that we have that program right there. Or as we learned previously, basically list all the files in /bin and then basically just filter anything that has bash in it using grep command. And there you go, we have the bash program's binary file right here. And that's what we are referencing in this line. So the shebang line points to the absolute path to the interpreter of your shell. /bin/bash is the default one for bash program. If you're using Windows, for example, git bash or something similar, the path will be different. Now you're probably wondering why we call it shebang line. And that's because of the first two characters right here. The first character pound or hashtag is also called sharp, and the exclamation mark here also called bang. So these two characters are basically sharp bang, and the short version of that is shebang. There you go. So using the shebang line, you can decide which shell you want to use. And as I mentioned, the bash is a more feature-rich and improved version of Bourne shell or sh. However, one advantage of using sh instead, the Bourne shell program, is that it can be executed on any Unix-like system because there is always the Bourne shell installed, whether it's an earlier or later version of the distributions. And this will basically point to the Bourne shell program and tell the operating system that we are using Bourne shell syntax here. So in our case, we're going to be writing a bash script. And that means if you're executing this file later on a server where bash is not installed, then you will actually get an error that this is not available on the system. And of course, you can specify any other shell program like dash or z, sh, etc. So that's basically the first line of our script. And now we can actually write the commands and the actual logic here. Now let's write basic script using just an echo command, which prints out whatever we type here. So we're going to echo setup and configure server. So that's going to be our simple script. So I'm going to save this in Vim, escape, then colon, write and quit. And now we have our setup.sh file that we can execute. So how do we actually execute such shell scripts? On Unix-like systems, we can simply do dot / and name of the file like this. And this will actually execute all the commands in that script. However, if I hit enter, you see permission denied. And that is because by default, when we create a new file, we don't have an execute permission on that file. And this is what we learned in the user permissions lecture. So if I do ls long display, right, with flag -l and the name of the file, you see that we don't have an execute permission for any of the owners for the file. And since I created the file, I am by default, my user is the owner of that file. However, as I said, we don't have an execute permission. So before we can execute, we need to add that permission. So I'm going to do sudo for user owner, and I can add this permission only for my user. So user plus execute permission for setup.sh. And I forgot change mode here. And again, first of all, we see X as an execute permission for the user owner. And also the color of that file changed because now this is an executable file. So with that, let's try to execute the setup script again. And there you go. This is basically just the echo command that got executed and just echoed whatever we typed in. And note that this way of executing shell scripts is universal. This is how you can execute any shell script, no matter which syntax it's written in. However, for bash specifically, we can also do bash and then name of the script file. And there you go. That works as well.